And so I'd like to start off by just saying it's truly humbling to be presenting this project to a room full of people who made this history. We'd like to thank the Wende Museum, and in particular, Justin and Sasha for organizing all of this. And we're deeply apologetic that we can't actually be there in the room with all of you. So Refuseniks Activists is a multi-partner digital archive dedicated to preserving and interpreting the history of the Free Soviet Jewry movement. The idea for the project emerged over a decade ago, but we began implementation only in 2023. In this brief presentation, I will discuss how the project is coming together and show some of our progress, and then I'll turn things over to Julie, who will show you the truly impressive things that the site can do. I should note from the outset that this is a long-term collaborative endeavor, not something that we plan on finishing next year or even in 10 years. I also want to make very clear that this is a partnership that, while spearheaded by the Blavatnik Archive, consists of many excellent partners and donors. Our current partners, and we're constantly expanding and constantly looking to expand, are the American Jewish Historical Society, ourselves, the Blavatnik Archive, the Center for Jewish History in the United States, the Central Archive of the History of the Jewish People in Israel, the National Library of Israel, and of course, the Wende Museum, in whose walls you are currently sitting. The main donors are the Blavatnik Family Foundation, Arcadia, and the David Berg Foundation. Now, each partner contributes its own collections and expertise in its own ways. Each partner is acknowledged by the project, and it's really been an incredible process bringing everyone together. Now, I also want to point out that we have an esteemed academic advisory committee, and some of our esteemed members are sitting amongst you in the auditorium right now. Gennady, for example, Shaul, and Anne are all among you, and we wish we were there with you as well. And I want to talk a little bit about the goals and motivations of this particular project. Our goal is largely to bring together and make available holdings on a variety of aspects of Soviet Jewish immigration and make this easily accessible in one digital archive. This means digitizing and making available holdings from a vast array of archives and making them more searchable. We believe in the importance and value of bringing these collections together in one central location. And I'd like to point out that the importance of cross-Iron Curtain connections has repeatedly been mentioned in this symposium, but the way that archival holdings work often work in such a way that the holdings are in one country or another, or the holdings focus on one community or another. Our idea is to bring all of this together. In addition to bringing together already existing holdings, we've embarked on an oral history project with participants from the movement and also launched a community history initiative encouraging refuseniks and activists to tell their story and allowing us to digitize their personal archives, thus saving them for posterity. Finally, we have a mission of interpreting the story for a wider audience, something I'll circle back to at the end of my half of this talk. So let me talk a little bit about the motivations for doing this particular project. We wanted to embark on this project for three major reasons. The first is to highlight this story that was so vital while it was happening and now is unfortunately largely forgotten outside of the communities of refuseniks and activists. And I should say as an aside, we're using the term refusnik very capaciously because the moment of truth of whether or not you are going to be refused or allowed to leave the Soviet Union happens only after you apply for that exit visa. So we're basically including all Soviet Jewish immigration in the rubric of refuseniks here. We wanted to tell this story in a variety of contexts. This is often a story that is told either from the perspective of the activists in the United States, Europe, and Israel who advocated for immigration from the Soviet Union, or from the perspective of those who immigrated themselves. So we want to bring these stories together and also embed these stories in multiple narratives, basically looking at the largest number of contexts to make this as interesting to the largest number of people. These include Jewish identity, the vitality of the movement for Jews in America, the Cold War, the particular phases of the Cold War and how they impacted people's ability to emigrate. I mean, this would have been impossible to imagine under Stalin, and it's really only under Brezhnev that it becomes at all plausible. And as we know, events shift under Brezhnev's reign and Gorbachev's reign that make leaving or staying, more or less likely. This is embedded in a story of global human rights. We're looking at how refuseniks and activists mobilized the global rhetoric of human rights and borrowed strategies and found solidarity with other civil rights movements, including, as people have already mentioned today at the symposium, the African American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. This is also a story of immigration. We want to focus on how the unique story of the Refuseniks fits into the larger history of both American and Israeli immigration, and how the influx of Soviet Jews impacted these societies. In short, we want to show the relevance of this movement to the widest possible range of audiences, people from legacy communities, scholars, educators, and just the general public at large. Our third major goal is to preserve and make accessible this history while many of those involved are still alive to tell their story. This includes, on the one hand, oral histories in the collection of personal archives, and on the other, modernizing access to holdings that are often difficult to find and search and dispersed across a variety of institutions. And as an aside, I should say that since we've started working on this in earnest, unfortunately, conflicts around the world have made access to the sites and archives where much of the pertinent information is much more difficult. So let me talk about a few of our current holdings, a little bit of give you a little bit of a sense of, what we have. Excuse me, one second then. So I want to point out from the beginning that this is a beta site. It's proof of concept. We only have about 1,200 objects right now, but we're expanding to tens of thousands in the near future. We have some exciting things in the pipeline that we'll be sessioning quite soonly. And one of our most impressive collections is, of course, Alexander Smuckler's massive collection of samizdat, which documents the life of the Soviet Jewry movement, their internal disputes, key texts about rediscovering how to be a Jew, about Jewish identity, about aspects of Soviet Jewish history that did not make it into the larger Soviet narrative, and simply exchanging information about how to emigrate successfully. And we can see in this collection, one of the things that I think is quite interesting is it goes from being this very, underground, basically typing on onion skin in the beginning, to, by the end of the movement, a highly professionalized, basically looks like something you have a subscription to. So that we see the kind of the growth of possibilities, and also the wide variety of texts. One of the most important texts that comes up in an oral history that we did with Sasha is the importance of Leonoris's Exodus as a key text for rediscovering Jewish identity. So we have all sorts of things here. We have religious texts, we have current events, we have fiction, nonfiction. Another major source I want to point to is the National Conference on Soviet Jewry. One of the most interesting things that we have there, this comes to us from the American Jewish Historical Society, are trip reports. What this was, and of course, Shaul, who is among you, knows this source perhaps better than anyone else, is these incredible narratives written by Jews who went over to the Soviet Union, generally as tourists, and they're reporting on what life is like for Soviet Jews. They're exchanging of information between activists in America and Jews in the Soviet Union, and their collection of information and advocacy for these people. This particular document is fantastic. It is Robert Wolfe and Lawrence Brandt's trip in 1974, where they go on a picnic that really reads like a series of misadventures. And this is a great source not only for the movement, but this is a great source basically just on late Soviet life and Cold War exchanges. Another resource that we have that that Julie will talk about for a bit is Natan Sharansky's archive. Now I should point out that with all of these, we have parts of all of these archives, and more is expanding, more and more is being digitized and added to our holdings. So we have a sampling right now. But we have Natan Sharansky's archives, including right now most of his letters to his family while he was in prison, something that Julie will talk about in just a little bit. Another major source we have is the Greater New York Conference on Soviet Jewry, which has striking visual materials. I want to just draw your attention to the materials around Solidarity Sunday, which was a mass march that was held in New York, generally shortly after Purim in the 70s and 80s, that really drew tremendous attention to the movement. We see here the Matzah of Hope, which was a prayer that was developed to support Soviet Jews. We see the striking visuals they have advertising the Solidarity Sundays, including this iconic, Let Our People Go. And we see the extent to which political figures were highly mobilized and people were highly mobilized. For those of you who are not ensconced in New York State politics, that is Al D'Amato, that is Ed Koch, the mayor of New York, that is Senator Moynihan, and that is a very, very young Chuck Schumer. And just to give a sense of the scale of the movement, this is, I believe, from 1987, although I could be wrong. But just we see hundreds of thousands of people coming out to support the Free Soviet Jewry movement. We also have a oral history project that Julie will give you some samples of in just a moment. And of course, Jerry Goodman's Russia Reports radio series, which is a series of interviews from the 70s and 80s with academics, with recently arrived Soviet Jewish emigres, with people who have just traveled to the Soviet Union. And the final thing that I want to draw your attention to as part of our mission of interpreting for a wider audience is we have articles. We basically commission scholars to explain, what exactly are Refuseniks? What is samizdat? How did the things that were made in the Free Soviet Jewry movement, advertise this movement in general? And this is written in a very, public-facing way, and we hope will be used in a variety of classrooms and settings. So having just kind of set up the macro of what we're doing, I'm going to turn things over to Julie, who can really show you the truly impressive things that the site can do and give you a micro-level interpretation.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Do you see this? Yeah, once again, it's really wonderful to be here with all of you. We are, of course, as you can tell, actually using the site to show you. Apologies if some things are not delivered quite as well because of the whole Zoom setup, but it's really important for us to make the point of how all of this material is freely accessible, freely available, and that's why we are doing it live. And so we've shown you the ways that raw primary sources dispersed throughout the world can come together on one platform. And we've promised to make more materials accessible. We've shown you some of the digital tools we're implementing, but it is really the next step, paves the way for new research, interpretations, and perhaps most importantly, allows for nuance to add depth to the familiar rhetoric of resistance, struggle, and triumph. So let's take a look at some case studies. For example, searching by a person's name was a popular first, when we started speaking to advisors, definitely a popular first request. And so I'm going to use the name of the wonderful, amazing person, Rabbi Haskell Lookstein. Some of you, I'm sure many of you know. And so we have results from across collections, from all the partners that have contributed any of their materials, including our own. So that means we can look at trip reports that he submitted over the years that are kept at American Jewish Historical Society. We can look at his interviews that were done with the infamous Jerry Goodman, and we can listen to them. And in fact, we also see his name in one of those letters that was mentioned that Natan Sharansky wrote from prison to his family. I know, and Laura, I heard your name mentioned so many times. I remember seeing the Refuseniks movie so many years ago, and yet there's always new things to discover. Reading these letters that he wrote from prison is just such a remarkable experience. The most upbeat, sort of philosophical, humor, intellectual person. And what we have done with these letters, and is we went ahead, we transcribed them in Russian, and we went ahead and we translated them into English so that material can be findable. For example, in this letter, it is relevant here. He sent in 1979, and he reported that his personal photographs were returned to him after the investigation, and he now has the opportunity to admire many of his, quote, accomplices: Haskell, Lookstein, Audrey, Levine, Connie, Smuckler, and others. We can do a different, for example, the subject or object of books interest us. And with that, we can see multiple, we can books published clandestinely within the Soviet Union, those smuggled in, translations such as what is, just realized I stopped using all of my tabs. What is a Jew? By Rabbi Morris Ketzer, the discussion and trip reports on what books to bring and how to bring them. And I'm once again going to refer to a letter from Natan Chervinsky that he wrote in March 10th, 1979, where exhaustive, never-ending list of books he would like to obtain during his incarceration. For example, he writes, in languages, this is primarily literature in English, American and English classics, good dictionaries, French, self-study guides, dictionaries, Lithuanian, fiction, research on Baltic languages, etc. Literature on history, economics, and politics about the regions that interest me, which are the Middle East, the West, the entire system of Russian-Lithuanian-Polish relations. When it comes to mathematical logic, heuristic programming, and computer programming, in economics, books on Western economics and management theory, particular firm management theory. In genetics, a fundamental, though not overly medical course that considers ideological issues such as the clash between genetics and evolutionary development theories. He was interested in quite a bit. That's quite a training list. And then there's the letters that talk about the pain that is in his eyes and his headaches and how he sort of tries to manage that reading list. I also cannot help but mention one other book, the way he studied Hebrew in prison. For many months now, my main source for expanding my Hebrew vocabulary has been Agatha Christie's Cards on the Table. My Hebrew is now akin to Natasha's English. Investigation, interrogation, weighty evidence, verdict. These form its foundation. I can only imagine how Agatha Christie would have been surprised, or rather outraged, to learn that her detective story, and to make matters worse, a translated one, became a source for endless grammatical, phonetic, and other exercises. How she would have objected if she knew that there is such a reader who, even at the most dramatic moments of the story, for example, when the police inspector announces during a party, gentlemen, our host has been stabbed, instead of tensely following the work of Poirot's brilliant mind, forces the guests to exclaim in unison, I will be stabbed, you will be stabbed, he will be stabbed, we will all be stabbed, and so on until the new verb is fully mastered. And finally, I'm going to play for you the explanation of the importance of the books for Soviet Jewry by the very person sitting amongst you, whose contribution was very much their production and distribution. Let's go.
Remember, I'm speaking about the time when there was no internet, no fax, no copy machines, no cell phones, etc., no computers, nothing. The book was our cell phone, our computer, it was a window to the normal world, because everything which was printed by the official Soviet propaganda, it was all associated with socialism, with communist ideas, and basically it was strictly propaganda. So that's why the books which I have read completely changed my mentality and my life, because it's really answered questions which I asked myself and never could find any answers. What means to be Jew? Why I'm Jewish? Why it's written in my passport?
Thank you for sharing that with us, Mr. Smuggler. Now, we can also do broader sort of searches that are not specific. So things like that are not going to come up in the transcripts. This was all based on searches from specific transcript. So, but we could do theme sort of searches like motivation, and motivation of those who were emigrating. What motivated them? It's not one answer, as Professor Gennady Estreich has shared with us.
What kind of motivations?
Sorry, we're just going to do that again.
What kind of motivations and how did it start? Some people would emigrate because they were religious and then wanted to live a full religious life, but it was not so easy possible in the Soviet Union. I know it's firsthand because my grandparents were really pious Jews. Second, it was the claustrophobic environment of the Soviet Union in various cultural, economic, or whatever, spiritual, if you want, sense. And people, especially younger people maybe, felt boxed inside and wanted to move on, yes. There were people who simply hated the Soviet system, not just as a box, but simply hated for whatever reason. Maybe some of them were inmates in Gulag, or their parents were inmates in Gulag, or whatever reasons. So it is very complex. Yeah, it is on the one hand we can treat it, and for many people it is certainly the decision was a result of some pressure or even repressions maybe they felt. Yeah. But certainly pressure, religious, cultural, whatever, economic, career pressure, and for some people it wasn't simply an opportunity, and I can't say what was really stronger. I mean, statistically, we have no idea. So it was really a process that carried many people.
And there is also the motivation, which many of you spoke about today, of joining the movement.
I remember asking my parents, so what did you do at the time of the Holocaust? My parents looked at me and said, you don't understand. I said, we didn't know, and when we knew, we felt as an American Jewish community powerless to act. Okay, so we resolved that we were going to be different. We were going to speak out. We didn't have that head space of being, careful. And also remember the American Civil Rights Movement gave us already that license, in a sense, to speak out against injustice.
And that was, of course, as many of you recognize, that was Glenn Richter, co-founder of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. Different, very perspective, but also talking about a theme of Jewish identity. And this is Professor Zvi Gittleman, who did not travel as an activist, was not a Refusnik, but he really traveled as a scholar who was trying to gather what was happening so that he could then share it with the policymakers back home.
I go to shul, and I went to shul for a month every Shabbos. And rather than sit in the tourist area, the diplomats area, we could see the Israeli diplomats and maybe some others, I sat anonymously in the crowd. And because I sat in the same seat all the time, I got to know the old men around me. One of them was a guy named Zalman. My last Shabbos in Moscow, I said to Zalman, Zalman, I'll give you the siddur because I know it's hard to get. He says, oh, that nonsense. I say, Zalman, du kommst in shul jeden Shabbos. You come to shul every Shabbos. What are you coming for? I said, what, you think I'm coming to pray? I take the metro to hear the chazan, the cantor. He's awful. I love to criticize him. So I said, Nashbarat, this is a man after my own heart. Both my father and I love Hazanos, love cantorial music. And indeed, the cantor in the Moscow synagogue was no great shakes. But I understood that even atheist Jews, for all I know he'd been a communist or was a communist, there was something for the older generation, and there were mainly two things as far as I could discern. One was food, and the other was music, that drew them back to a pre-Soviet or early Soviet period.
And even though we only have 1,200 items so far, there are already, we easily recognize new directions for exploration. For example, and thank you for mentioning this earlier, I believe it was David, the incredibly important role of women in the movement. We had the incredible honor to sit with the 4 women who were the directors of the Greater New York Conference on Soviet Jewry, and just a very short on problem solving by women.
When someone told us we couldn't do something,
Sorry.
when someone told us we couldn't do something, we found a way to do it. There was no such thing as you can't, or it's no.
Right, and until someone says no, the answer is yes.
Yes.
And then even once they do say no, maybe.
It's a maybe.
It's a maybe,
We could
right.
figure out how no turns into maybe yes.
I'm not gonna play these next videos, especially since they are in Russian. We have not translated yet, but I do want to touch on the nuances that come out. So, for example, in her interview, Elizabeth Reines talks about the multi-generation. She talks about the effect that being a refusenik had on her young teenage daughter. She said, first of all, she got gifts, things that others didn't have. So she probably stood out in school because of her clothes, because of her behavior. She had impressions about a different world. Of course, she didn't talk about what was happening at home, but her behavior made her stand out. Or Leonid Reines, who does talk about what did happen with that aid when aid came from the West. And he says, visitors would come and say, you know who needs this, and leave a big bag of things for distribution. The large bag of stuff that was brought usually included things that were not new, or they wouldn't be able to pass customs. Little pieces of paper indicated intended recipient. I had to take the stuff, use public transportation to distribute, knock on the door of other refuseniks. Some did not choose to receive foreign visitors, hoping their quietness would facilitate quicker departure. And sometimes the reaction would be, where are the fancy things from the West? Did you keep the good stuff for yourself? We have so much more, of course, to show you. To conclude, the nuances, the experiences, the moments, the themes all stem from the personal. They'll stem from the individual. I'm going to skip over some of this, and everybody has shared their personal story. I just want to say that's me. That's me at the age of 4. We are all packed, ready to go, ready to emigrate after my parents were nearly 4 years refuseniks. And these are the personal stories that make our project, that will make our project what it is. It's the engagement. It's the engagement of everybody in this room. And even in these times when sometimes we can't necessarily gather together, and it has to sort of last beyond the walls of a room, we encourage you to come to share your story. We've launched this public platform for you to just record yourself on any phone or computer, and we really hope to hear your story as well. And the last thing I just want to say is we want to thank Wende, we want to thank Justin, Kara, Michael. We want to thank everybody who's here, and we're thrilled to be part of it. Thank you so much.